Welcome to Difficult Dialogues, Voices from the Valley. I am Lynn Pasquerella, president of Mount Holyoke College. Difficult Dialogues is intended to bring to bear voices from the Valley on a number of complex social issues of the day. Today, I'm joined by Kaneka Turner, who's an elementary mathematics specialist from Charlotte, North Carolina, and by Michael Flynn, who is the Director of Mathematics Leadership Programs at Mount Holyoke College. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Kaneka, there's been a lot of controversy around the Common Core. Tell us about the impetus for Common Core.
When I think about this, I think about an analogy. We've been teaching mathematics in a very specific way for a long period of time. There hasn't been much that's changed. And as students are changing, and as a result of kind of the influence of society and lots of other environmental things, the need to shift the way we teach math, we're discovering that this is also changing. So like if you think about that and kind of lay that beside what's happened in medicine, there were practices in medicine that we used for years and years that we no longer use because we found new practices that have proven to be more effective in light of the shifts and changes that have happened within the body. The same thing has happened with education, particularly in math. We've discovered that some of the practices that we've used in the past have been proven to be ineffective and aren't equipping our children and learners at large with what they need to be successful as math thinkers and logical kind of in logical reasoning. So I think that at the heart of it, that is what brings about the need for the shift in standards and the Common Core.
Great. And Mike, how would you explain the significance of Common Core?
So, I mean, I think one of the things that's really significant, well, actually one thing that's not different is that common standards aren't new in education. Right. I think that's one of the things that happens with this issue is that people are making a big deal about having these common standards, but states have had standards in education for years, and teachers like them. That's nice to know at whatever grade level you're teaching, you have a list of concepts and skills that need to be addressed. And so that's not changed at all. Right. What's different is that we've taken, instead of having individual states with individual interests doing things their own way in a very insular way, a silo way where Massachusetts has their way of doing it, North Carolina has their way of doing it. We're looking where states are actually pooling resources now to say that we'll have a common set of standards that we can all agree upon, and that'll allow families that move from state to state to be able to have similar math experiences, so that if you went to second grade in Massachusetts and they moved to Charlotte, that you're not repeating the same curriculum when you're in third grade because they have it aligned differently. So it allows for some continuity, but it also allows for cost savings in terms of professional development and textbooks, because textbook companies no longer have to design textbooks that work in some states and then have another edition that work in other states. That we have basically a common set of standards, and so that's actually a good thing. And I think what happens around the controversy is the stuff that's around the Common Core state standards. So that you have the standards which say what should be taught and when. And within the math standards, there's something called the mathematical practice standards. There's 8 of them, which is actually, I think, the most important part of the Common Core. Agree. And those 8 standards describe ways in which kids should be interacting with math on a daily basis. And those are also really solid. So that's at the heart of it. And those by themselves really aren't controversial. What's controversial are the extraneous things around it. Most importantly, I think just the rollout, the implementation of the Common Core standards. And so in 2009, 52 authors got together to write these standards, and it was based on research, it was based on best practices. They were written on these progressions that actually looked at developmental psychology and how kids come to understand certain concepts and when. And they took these progressions that followed the thinking of within any given math strand from kindergarten all the way up through grade 12. So that kind of information is what fed the development of Common Core. And so the document was created, and then districts were then charged with rolling it out. And that's where things started to fall apart. And I think that's where some of this controversy now began to surface, because the rollout hasn't always been smooth. In some places, it's just been thrown in and without giving teachers any kind of training to understand the new standards and what's needed. On top of that, I think nationally, we're looking at implementing high-stakes testing tied to these standards before they've even had a chance to simmer and develop. And if you add to that the pressure of tying teacher evaluation to the high-stakes test that's testing these new standards that haven't developed, you're creating a system now where people are feeling nervous. And so teachers are nervous, administrators are nervous, parents are nervous. And in some ways, I feel like that's created the conditions are ripe for people to have strong opinions against it. And I think some of that's misplaced, and but I think that's kind of gives us a sense of where we are and how we got here.
Certainly the teachers' unions have raised concerns about tying performance to the performance of the children in the classroom. There's been a conservative push against the Common Core for a variety of reasons, and the way that the math component is framed seems to ridicule what's called the new math. Kaneka, talk about the new math and what that means.
So in short, new math tends to be what's the words that are used to describe a shift from a more traditional math education, probably much like what all three of us experienced in school, to more constructivist approaches, inquiry-based approaches that are moving kids towards reasoning. So it's not just about the what and the how, but it's about the why, and learners really thinking about how math works and how concepts fit together and develop into larger concepts.
Okay, so it's not just about getting the right answer.
Absolutely.
It's about understanding the process.
Absolutely.
This seems to make sense. Why is there such a push against this?
I think it's new. I think that's part of it, is that anything that looks different than what people are used to seeing or what they've experienced it can be scary. And so if you think about everybody in this country has gone through education. Everybody has seen teachers doing their job. Everybody's been in math class. They have a real sense of what they think math class looks like. And, but it's changed. And so the math class that I grew up in is not the same math class that my kids are experiencing right now. And I come from an education background, so I understand why the decisions are being made to teach math in this way, but a lot of people don't. And so when their kids come home with a homework assignment that doesn't look like that page of 30 problems that you're just supposed to plug through like the way we all did, it's scary in some ways. And I feel like, so that's one reason for some of the backlash, is that it's just new and people don't necessarily understand it. It's funny, actually, I tell people often that, going back to your medical piece, that when I work with parents sometimes to help them understand Common Core, I show a picture of it's a box with gears on it and has this long protruding like drill bit on it. And I ask people to guess what it is, and people think it's a pencil sharpener, or they say it's some kind of mechanical tool. So they're not sure exactly what it is, but it's a dentist drill from the 1800s. And I often ask people to imagine going to your dentist and saying, well, this is how people used to get their teeth drilled. I want this for my kid. No one would do that. We're thankful that medicine's progressed in a way that we have really good equipment that can handle any drilling. We have great medicine that numbs the area. There's a lot of great, there's been a great evolution in medicine that's better for all of us. But the way that we taught arithmetic, back when you just line the numbers up and you just do the calculations without thinking, has been around as long as that dentist drill has been around. And don't we want more than that for our kids? And education's evolved quite a bit. And so I think people are sometimes scared of things that are new, but I think it's really important to recognize that there's been a lot of new learning around how kids think and reason and learn, and that those need to be taken into account when we're thinking about education reform.
I remember when my own children were beginning to learn math, they would have a problem, 2 + 2 = 4. That's how I learned it. They learned it in this way. what expression best exemplifies the solution to 2 + 2? And I thought, well, that's very good, because then there's a tying of math to literacy. And when they get to those more complex problems, they won't get thrown by this language. And I thought, does a 6 or 7-year-old really need to understand these words? And the answer is yes. And it's not too early to introduce them. And so a lot of the criticism has been around the use of language in introducing mathematical concepts. Kaneka, can you talk about that connection between literacy, math literacy, and the capacity to read?
Absolutely. With the rollout of the Common Core, particularly in Charlotte, an avenue that we took was to find a commonality between what was happening in literacy and what was happening in math, so that we would have a common space for teachers to work from and a common space for the community at large. And so where we landed was on argumentation. So argumentation is a standard in literacy that runs completely through K-12, and argumentation is also one of the practice standards. There's more to it, but one of the practice standards for math that runs also K-12. So we had this common space that we could work from, and then current research around that with regards to the math classroom supports the idea that children just expressing their ideas, expressing their understanding, and just going back and forth and challenging thoughts in the classroom promotes math proficiency. And we've always known that for language. We've always known that in all of the other content areas. In fact, debate and pushback, challenge around ideas is something that we encourage in science, social studies, literacy. But there's something about the math classroom that says, this is where it stops. This is where you sit and you get it and you do it. And we don't really question why. So much so I have 2 boys of my own, one in high school and one in middle school. And so much so to where when you ask children, so what do you think about that? There's this pause, there's this silence. What do you want me to think about that? They wait for you to tell them, but you have thoughts. No one's ever asked them that. So we found common ground in that area and a way to help kids make sense of this shift across all content areas by going in from the language and productive discourse.
Can I jump in on that too a little bit? So one other thing that's important with language is that the ways in which kids learn to make sense of math is one through modeling, through actually creating representations that show what multiplication looks like. So for instance, like being able to see multiplication as like a rectangular dimension, like the area of a rectangle, or an array, like a grid system basically of rows and columns, and that an 8x5 grid is 8 times 5, which in those little squares is actually 40. That mental representation of multiplication is really important for kids to understand. It's not just count by 8 5 times, or 8 + 8 + 8, but that they actually understand that they have a visual representation to make sense of multiplication. But there's also, kids make sense of math through contextualization. So being able to actually create a story context that would demonstrate 8 times 5. And I saw this happen once where I was tutoring some 3rd graders who by all observation looked like they understood basic multiplication. I'd given them a problem, 9 times blank equals 27. And they all quickly said 3. And they had memorized their math facts. And I thought to push them a little further to see, like, so what do they really understand about this? So I asked them to create a story that would represent 9 times 3. And one kid said, well, you have 9 pillows and you times them by 3. And it's like, well, what does that mean? He's like, I don't know. He just times it. And 2 other kids gave addition. They said you have 9 and then you add 3 more. And none of them could actually create a story that actually would show 9 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 9. And so helping kids to develop the ability to actually create a context, a real life context of that demonstrates the mathematical idea they're working on, is really powerful to help deepen their understanding, and those are two big things that we never experience as learners. When you just are taught to solve a particular procedure, you miss out on actually being able to create these contexts. And so in my capacity where I work with teachers now in professional development, this is a big focus for us, is that we help teachers to start creating representations and story contexts for the math that we're doing. And it's amazing the amount of mathematics that's been hidden from teachers. And when you give them the opportunity to create a model of multiplication, or like even last week we were working with some teachers on division of fractions, and this whole idea of the invert and multiply rule, that when these teachers actually had a chance to create a representation of what that was and then put a context around it, every one of them said, I now get why we invert and multiply. It's just this thing that they've always known that it worked, now they knew why it worked. And it came from being able to put some language to it and being able to put a visual representation of that. And that's extremely powerful. And that's a big part of Common Core, is having teachers provide these kinds of experience for their students. And that's very different than the math class that we grew up with, and that's a big shift. And I will say, just one challenge with that is that because all of us have grown up in a very different math system, teachers, mostly when we go into the classroom, we teach the way we were taught. I was the same way. When I was not a great math teacher when I first started teaching, I really taught very traditionally. And I had a great textbook that the program we were using was this investigations math curriculum, which is very progressive, all about developing ideas and things. And when I first taught, I was given no training. I was handed this book, and I taught it as traditionally as you could teach it. I took these rich lessons, and I pulled all the math out of it, and I put it up on the board, and I just showed kids how to do that, and because I didn't know better. And then, but what this speaks to is the need for training. And so I'm where I am today in the math field because I had lots of professional development that helped me to rethink math for myself, and then rethink how kids come to learn math. And Kaneka's been right with me in this, and she and I have done a lot of professional development together, both as participants and also as leaders. And we've seen time and time again the power of helping teachers rethink math for themselves, which then transfers into the classroom, but they help their students rethink math. And that's, that's what's needed.
You know, Mike, that makes me think about a question that you asked earlier around the controversy. And I think that having this realization about math through professional development experiences kind of pushes us into a space where we want to kind of go back and change, like totally overhaul our math classroom. And I think that might be behind some of the pushback around Common Core, in that Common Core doesn't suggest that there isn't a place for students to have fluency with some of those skills and facts that we are used to, and that we would probably assign as more traditional. It does call for a marriage, if you will, between the ideas. But the challenge seems to come in creating that balance. What does it look like? And so training, to just kind of piggyback on what you were just saying, training seems to be critical in helping teachers both unpack what the new ideas are, what's behind the math that they already know, and to help them figure out how to make that work in the current classroom. So how do they align this newfound understanding that they have with what they had before the newfound understanding was unlocked? Where does that exist in the classroom for teachers and for children? That's a challenge.
Very much so.
There was a cover story article in the New York Times Magazine recently about the Common Core and math. Pointed out that we're woefully behind many other nations in terms of our math proficiency. Why is that?
I think a lot of it has to do with the traditional way math was taught. I mean, when math's taught as just a list of procedures, and that I think to quote part of the article, they talked about the I, we, you method, where the teacher says, I'm going to show you this method, and then we're going to practice it once, and then you are going to do it on your own, keep your eyes on your own paper. I think that's what they said in the article. But that method doesn't doesn't actually, so when kids learn that way, they're really working off of memory. Can they remember what the teacher told them to do versus working from understanding, which is, I understand why this should work. And that's, I often use we're very analogous, and so the one I often use when I talk to people about the difference between the traditional way math was taught and the new way was traveling to Boston. So back pre-GPS time, when I had to go to Boston, I would print out MapQuest directions, and I would read them over and over and over again because I didn't want to be looking at a map while trying to drive in Boston. It's just crazy. You don't want to get hurt or hurt anyone. So I would try to commit these directions to memory, and that's basically, MapQuest directions are a set of steps to get you to a destination. An algorithm is a set of steps that get you to destination, which is an answer. So I would go to Boston, and invariably driving in Boston, I'd make a wrong turn, or a road wasn't signed very well and I missed it. And I always, the whole time I was driving there, I had this panic because I really had no idea where I was. And I was really rooted to these steps, and if I lost these steps or I made one wrong move, I was sunk, and I either had to try to go back and retrace my steps to get to where I was going, or pull over and ask for help. And the same thing is true in a math classroom, that if kids only have a procedural understanding of math, then they just have this vague sense of where they are. They're just, they're doing these things, and they're getting the answer because Mrs. So-and-so told them they would, and as long as they're getting the right marks on their paper, they know they're doing okay, but they have no sense of where they are. And it doesn't take long to push them into an area where they can't work anymore. So if the problem was presented differently, that some kids have no way into it. It's like they don't know what to do because they've just had procedural understanding. And you can see this with any times where people have trouble counting back change, or I mean, in real life math where people need that algorithm. They need, you'll see people in supermarkets trying to carry and do this in the while they're shopping. So people, they just have this vague sense of math because of that. But if you actually take the time to drive around Boston and explore it, to look at a map and see how the streets intersect and see where major landmarks are, it takes a little bit more time, and it looks a little murky at first. It feels like, especially if you drive around there, you're going to get lost, you're going to make mistakes. But in the end, what's going to happen is this clarity that you never would have got if you just relied on MapQuest. You're going to be able to not only identify a way to a particular destination, but probably faster ways at any given time. And that's the same thing we want for kids. And so if you let kids explore math, if you let them develop their strategies for solving addition or subtraction or multiplication or anything, that it's murky at first. So they might be solving the problem using tally marks or building something with cubes, and it looks really inefficient. And that's often where parents and other critics might come in and say, but it takes so long. Why are you doing this? They can get the answer just like this if I just show them this thing. But what they're doing is they're developing that understanding the same way you would if you were driving around Boston. And so all of a sudden they see that if you have an amount here and you have an amount here and you switched them around and you added them up in a different order, you still get the same amount. Like kids start to see that, and they start to own this idea of commutativity. It's like these math ideas start to develop and are solid, rather than you just saying, you can add numbers in any order. Just trust me, it works. That's fine. And so that's the big shift. And so for so long in our country, we've been doing the MapQuest style of teaching. And so everyone's got this vague sense of math, and they can do it to a point. But if you were to give a group of adults a 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication problem, which is often what I do when I do parent math nights, and just say solve it in your head, there's a level of panic that starts to happen in there. And when you ask people, why are you feeling that way, they say, well, I only know one way to do this. And so that's a great place to start when you're working with people to understand Common Core, is to say, so wouldn't you want to have more ways? Wouldn't that be a nice thing? And wouldn't you want that for your kids, so that they're not stuck with just one particular way to solve one problem and a different way to solve a different problem, but that they have a toolbox of strategies that make sense, and they're able to choose the right one at the right time and be really efficient and thoughtful problem solvers.
So it might do something to address the math anxiety that we hear so much about.
Absolutely.
There's also been a push in the United States to engage girls and students of color in the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math. Are we making progress?
I think slow and steady. Overall, what's happening and what the Common Core is calling for, I believe, is inclusiveness, right? So it's moving us towards, as Mike was describing with the toolbox, with strategies, but I think even bigger than that, a sense of reasoning. So understanding how ideas connect and reasoning about, given any problem, how to enter in. And I think that that transcends race and it transcends sex. It avails itself to just all. It's very inclusive. And so if we continue on the road that we're on, I believe that we'll see a shift in what's happening with girls, in addition to what's happening with African American children, and find that they are making gains.
Excellent. We just have a few minutes left. Mike, tell us about the program at Mount Holyoke that you're directing right now.
Oh, great. Well, I often tell people about the programs that I'm not only the director, but I was also a client. I actually went through the system. That was one of the professional development experiences that really transformed my teaching. So at Mathematics Leadership Programs, what we're doing is we provide professional development for teachers where we actually engage them in math as learners. So they come and relearn mathematics in a way that's based on conceptual understanding. Like I mentioned with the fraction work that we were doing last week, that we give teachers an opportunity to become learners, to go through particular strands of mathematics and really deepen their understanding of the math. Because when teachers understand the math conceptually, they can teach it much better. And so we start with, so that's a big component of what we're doing, is having teachers do math for themselves. But at the same time, we also analyze cases, written cases from classrooms where we actually see dialogue of students and teachers interacting around the same math idea, and watch video from classrooms where teachers are engaged in these ideas with students. And what teachers, our participants, are able to do is take the math that they experience as a learner and couple that with the analysis of these cases and student thinking that we're looking at. And it builds a really good, solid understanding for these teachers around the content and the pedagogical knowledge. So they actually know the math and how kids come to learn that math really well. And what's really helpful with this program is that we talked about these 8 standards of mathematical practice that are a big part of Common Core. And they really are, I think they're the most important piece that's come out of this. And in order for teachers to really understand that, they need to experience it. And that's one thing that we're able to do, is give teachers that live on-the-ground experience. And Kaneka is one of our students in the program, so she can talk a little bit about what it's like to be doing this math for herself. But that's definitely, it's a huge thing we're doing right now that I think is what we need as a country for Common Core professional development. Our experiences like these, where teachers are doing the math and then really deepening their understanding about how kids come to understand the math.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, unfortunately we're out of time, but thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I can't think of any more critically important work than the work that you two are doing, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.